Part 5. Inspection of aircraft upon arrival from foreign airports. Section 29. Aircraft to be inspected. All the aircraft from the foreign airport are subject to the quarantine inspection upon entry in any airport of the Philippines. Aircraft cleared in one airport in the Philippines are deemed cleared for all other airports in the country except in cases of any aircraft with an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, public health, emergency, and of international concern, and death on board. Section 30. Requirements of aircraft to be inspected. 30.1. Any aircraft from foreign airport bound to the Philippines shall land first an airport or of entry unless permission to land elsewhere is first granted by the appropriate authorities, and after such a permission has been granted, the director of quarantine must immediately be notified on the time and place of arrival. It shall be the responsibility of any airline company operating an aircraft engaged in international flight to notify within 48 hours of the Bureau of Quarantine of the estimated time of arrival of the aircraft of quarantine inspection and clearance. Such notice shall specify the following: date and time of arrival, type of aircraft, flight number and registration mark or aircraft ID, airport of origins, number of person on board, submit or 30.3, submit a duly accomplished aircraft general declaration upon arrival. Section 31. Requirements from the commander of the aircraft to be inspected. The aircraft commander of an airline representative must inform the Bureau of the Quarantine because of its arrival the following conditions on the board. 31.1. Cases of infection disease subject to the regulation emerging disease and public health emergency of international concern occurring the airport origin. 31.2. Persons afflicted with illness on board or a person who is suspected to have an infectious disease subject to the regulation of emerging disease and public health emergency of the international concern. 30.1. Death on board from any cause. 31.4. The transport of the patient passenger who are medically evacuated regardless of the nature of the case. 31.5. He shall also provide the passenger list and seat number, cargo manifest, aircraft configuration to the quarantine medical officer on duty and facilitate the medical examination of the passenger and crew by the officer on duty whenever necessary. Section 32. Boarding of aircraft placed under quarantine. 32.1. In case of notification of the presence of the suspected cases of the infectious disease subject to the regulation, emerging disease and public health emergency of international concern and death on board the aircraft, no person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer and his accredited assistant for proper evaluation and management. Disembarkation of the other passengers shall not be allowed until such time that the aircraft has been granted a quarantine clearance. 32.1.1. Suspect case shall be medically evaluated at the holding area and transported to the designated referral hospital for isolation. 32.1.2. The remaining passenger and the crew of the aircraft, if the need arises, shall be medically evaluated in the quarantine inspection area at the airport terminal. 32.1.3. Crew and the passenger who may be possibly exposed to the disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease and public health emergency of the international concern may be isolated or undergo voluntary home confinement or quarantine. 32.1.4. Any person who have entered confines quarantine inspection area during the quarantine inspection of passengers. Without the permission of the quarantine medical officer shall be subjected to the quarantine restriction. 32.2 In case when the aircraft is exposed to radiological, biological, or chemical terrorism, the tailored action of an incident should be followed in accordance to the interim guidance on preparedness and response of radiological, biological, and chemical incidents. Section 33. Vector control for aircraft. All 33.1 All aircraft shall be disinfected in accordance with the rule and regulation of the World Health Organization and the International Civilization Organization. However, in the view of the danger introduction of the insect which are vector of the infectious disease, subject to the regulation emerging disease and public health emergency of the international concern, aircraft arriving from the airport shall be subjected to the following measures in addition to the in-flight disinfection when necessary. The aircraft shall be disinfected after disembarkation of passenger. The cabins, cockpit, baggage compartment, and other place in the aircraft shall be sprayed with an approved type of aerosol insecticide or a lure of this upon vaporization from the hand spray of recommended insecticide. 3.2.1 Restore and disinfection of cargo hold can be performed as per request. Active anti-mosquito measures shall be maintained with a protective area extending for a distance of at least 400 meters around the perimeter of airport of entry. A regular surveillance and monitoring of the presence of adults and larval Aedes aegypti is undertaken to maintain the Aedes aegypti within the recommended limit and required by the World Health Organization. 32.2.2 All breeding places of flies, mosquito, and other insects shall be eliminated and appropriate measures should be implemented in control of this vector. The Bureau of Quarantine form a time to time or appropriate measures against this vector. Section 34. Requirements of aircraft before departure. No aircraft shall be allowed to depart from any airport of the Philippines to foreign destination without securing an outgoing quarantine clearance from the Director of Quarantine or his DALI authority representative. This clearance shall be granted to the aircraft on condition that such an aircraft has observed all quarantine requirements imposed. This clearance shall be requirement for the granting of the customs clearance for departure. Section 35. Embarkation of travels for international flight. The director of the quarantine in the consider necessary may order the medical examination of travelers and may disallow of any suspected person having an infectious disease subject to the regulation emerging disease public emergency of international concern from embarkation on the international flight except in case of transport of sick person by conveyance especially provided for the purpose in order to safeguard the health of other passengers and the crew. Section 36. Personnel assigned for aircraft inspection. The quarantine inspection of aircraft shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and the DALI accredited assistant designated by the director of quarantine. Airport where there is no quarantine medical officer, a DALI trained physician will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as an acting alternative quarantine medical officer upon the recommendation of the director of quarantine, who shall perform such a function on annual contractual basis. Section 37. Time of aircraft quarantine inspection. Section 37. Time of aircraft quarantine inspection. Inspection of the aircraft required by this regulation shall be made between 800 to 1,200 hours and 1,300 to 1,700 hours Monday to Friday. Any inspection performed outside of these hours and during Saturday, Sunday, and holiday shall be compensated for, hence reasonable reimbursement by the concerned airline may be allowed by the director of quarantine in relation to the incurred expenses and service rendered by each quarantine personnel. Part 6. Requirements of the domestic aircraft. Section 38. Aircraft to be inspected. All domestic aircraft with the existence of an infectious disease subject to the regulation emerging disease, public health emergency of international concern, and death on board are subject to the quarantine inspection. In ports where there are no quarantine official, inspection and clearance of this aircraft will be coordinated with the local health authorities, such as police or any. Section 39. Requirements from the commander of the aircraft to be inspected. The aircraft commander or the airline representative must inform the Bureau of Quarantine before its arrival the following condition on board. 39.1. Cases of infection disease subject to the regulation emerging disease and public health emergency of international concern occurring at the airport of origins. 39.2. Person afflicted with the illness on board or a person who is suspected to have infectious disease subject to the regulation emerging disease and public health emergency of international concern. 39.3. Death on board from the any cause. 39.4. The transport of patient passenger who are medically evacuated regardless of the nature of the case. 39.5. He shall also provide the passenger list and seat number of cargo manifest aircraft configuration to the quarantine medical officer on duty and facilitate the medical examination of passenger and crew by the officer on duty whenever necessary. Section 40. Immunization. Requirements. The director of the quarantine may from time to time prescribe or required immunization from a certain disease if in his description such as requirements are essential on account of very public health conditions. Section 41. Embarkation of travelers for the domestic flight. The direction of quarantine may disallow the embarkation of any suspected person having contagious disease of this infection disease subject to the regulation, emerging disease, and public health emergency of international concern in order to safeguard the health of the crew and the other passenger. Section 42. Personnel assigned for the inspection of the domestic aircraft. The quarantine inspection of the domestic aircraft shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and his duly accredited assistant, designated by the director of the quarantine. An airport where is no quarantine medical officer, a duly trained physician will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as acting alternative quarantine medical officer upon recommendation of the director of the quarantine and shall be performed such a function of annual contractual basis. So, as you observe, domestic or international flight, the the process of inspection of the Bureau of Quarantine is still the same. There's no there is no exemption even if international or domestic flight. All inspection will be equal, all the process of the inspection will be equal. Section 43. Section 43. Boarding of the domestic aircraft placed under the quarantine. 43.1. In case of identification of the presence of suspected case of infectious disease subject to the regulation, emerging disease, public health emergency of international concern, or death on a board aircraft, no person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer or his accredited assistant for the proper evaluation and management. Disembarkation of the other passengers shall not be allowed until such time that the aircraft has been granted quarantine clearance. For the 3.1.1, suspect case shall be medically evaluated at the holding area and transported to the designated referral hospital for isolation. And for the 3.1.2, the remaining passenger and crew of the aircraft, if the need if the need arises, shall be medically evaluated in the quarantine inspections area at the airport terminal. For the 3.1.3, crew and the passenger who may be possibly exposed to the disease subject to the regulation, emerging disease, and public health emergency of international concern may be isolated or undergo voluntary home confinement or quarantine. 3.1.4, any person who enters the confined or quarantine section as during the quarantine inspection of the passenger with permission of the quarantine medical official subject to the quarantine restriction. 3.2, in cases where the aircraft is exposed to radiological, biological, or chemical tailored action, such incidents should be followed in accordance with regulations on preparedness response to radiological, biological, chemical incident. So as I said earlier, from while I'm under the Bureau of Quarantine, even if international flight or domestic flight, as well as I said again, there's no exemptions on the inspection, examination. There's no exemption. It's all the same process domestic or international flight is. So that's all for the part 6. Part 7. Detention of the conveyance under quarantine. Section 44. Conveyance placed in the detention any vessel or aircraft which the director of the quarantine determines and considered to be infected with disease subject to the regulation emerging disease and public health emergency of international concern shall be detained in quarantine. Section 45. Requirements of the conveyance in detention. No conveyance under quarantine is allowed to move or maneuver without the permission of the director of the quarantine. Vessel under quarantine shall fly a yellow flag while under detention. Section 46. Detention of the persons. Person on board a conveyance under the detention shall be subjected to the restriction imposed by the director of the quarantine.